In 1968, a woman photographing the reading room of a public library in Evansville, Indiana, developed her film and found a shape she could not explain. A pale, elongated figure stood between the shelves, in a spot where no patron had been standing. She wasn't the only one who saw something. Librarians had already been reporting cold spots and the smell of lavender for years. What she captured on film would turn a century-old building into one of the most photographed haunted sites in the Midwest. And it's only the first stop on a list that gets stranger from here. Indiana doesn't look like a state that hides things. It's flat, agricultural, dotted with grain silos and small-town courthouses. But underneath that ordinary surface is a long history of institutions that failed the people inside them, roads that were never meant to be found twice, and homes where tragedy left a mark that locals still won't talk about after sunset. This isn't a list of jump scares. It's a list of places where real events, documented, historical, sometimes tragic, created reputations so persistent that they've outlived the people who lived through them. We start in Evansville, at Willard Library. The library opened in 1885, funded by a coal merchant named Willard Carpenter, who wanted Evansville to have a library open to everyone regardless of race or gender, a genuinely progressive idea for the time. The building itself, all dark wooden Gothic revival stonework, was built to feel permanent, almost ecclesiastical. The ghost story started decades later, in the 1930s, when a janitor reported seeing a woman in gray in the basement, near the old coal chute. He quit the same night. For years the story stayed local, the kind of thing librarians mentioned to explain a draft or flickering light. Then, in the 1990s, the library did something unusual. Instead of downplaying the stories, it installed public webcams throughout the building, in the children's section, the reading room, the basement, and put the live feed online, inviting anyone in the world to watch for the lady in gray. That decision changed everything. Visitor log from that period show an increase in walk-in traffic specifically asking about the cameras. Staff began keeping a binder of viewer-submitted screenshots, shadows, shapes, anomalies caught on the public feed, sent in from strangers with no connection to the building or its history. Nobody has ever proven what the lady in gray is, or was. The most common theory ties her to a bitter custody dispute over the library building itself, involving Carpenter's daughter, decades before his supposed appearance. But that theory came after the sightings, not before, a story built backward to explain something the town had already decided was real. The cameras are still running today. You can watch them right now, from anywhere in the world. Most nights, nothing happens. That unpredictability is exactly why the feed has never lost its audience. One of the most cited moments from the webcam era involves a man seated alone in the reading room late one evening, a book open in front of him, unaware that anyone was watching. Viewers monitoring the live feed from outside the building said the pages of his book appeared to turn on their own, once, while his hand stayed folded in his lap. He never looked up. Library staff reviewed the footage afterward and found no draft, no vent, no explanation for the movement. The clip was never verified beyond the original recording, and the man himself was never identified or interviewed. He simply finished his book and left, apparently never knowing what dozens of strangers online had just watched happen beside him. If Willard Library represents a haunting the town chose to embrace, the next location represents one it tried, for decades, to erase. Just outside Indianapolis, on the old grounds of what was once Central State Hospital, a scattering of unmarked graves sits beneath a stretch of grass that most drivers pass without a second glance. Central State opened in 1848 as the Indiana Hospital for the Insane. For over 100 years, it operated as the state's primary institution for patients with severe mental illness, and for much of that history, its record was not one of care, but of neglect. State inspection records from the early 20th century describe overcrowding so severe that patients slept in hallways. Understaffing meant that violent incidents went unaddressed for hours. When patients died without family to claim them, and thousands did, they were buried on the grounds itself, in graves marked only with a number. The hospital closed in 1994 after a series of investigations into patient treatment. Most of the original buildings were demolished, but the cemetery remained, and so did the numbers, more than 1,600 of them, corresponding to patients whose names were, for decades, kept only in a ledger inside the hospital's administrative archive. In 2016, a local genealogy project finally cross-referenced those ledgers with numbered plots, giving names back to people who had been buried as statistics. It was one of the largest identification efforts of its kind in the state's history. What remains on the site today is a small museum inside one surviving building, run largely by volunteers, and a cemetery that the city has never quite decided what to do with. Locals who grew up nearby describe a specific kind of avoidance, not fear of ghosts, but a discomfort with what the ground represents. The site doesn't need a supernatural explanation to feel heavy. The documented history does that on its own. But not every location on this list carries the weight of an institution. Some are far more personal: a single house, a single family, a single night that a whole neighborhood never forgot. That brings us to Hanna House, on the south side of Indianapolis. Built in 1858 by Alexander Hanna, a prosperous farmer and state senator, the house was, by most accounts, an unremarkable success story for its first several years, a large Italianate home reflecting a family doing well for itself. Then came the story that made it famous, one that's been repeated so often it's difficult to separate documented fact from local embellishment. According to the account passed down through Indianapolis oral history, the house served as a stop on the Underground Railroad. A fire broke out in the basement. The story says a lantern was knocked over and several people hiding there were unable to escape in time. Historical verification of the Underground Railroad claim specifically is difficult. Indianapolis did have documented Underground Railroad activity, and Hanna's political affiliations align with abolitionist sympathies of the era, but no surviving records definitively confirm this particular house as a station. What is verifiable is that Alexander Hanna lived in the home until his death in 1895, and that the house passed through several owners over the following century, each contributing a new layer to its reputation. Later owners reported smelling smoke with no fire source. Funeral home operators who ran the building as a business in the mid-20th century described unexplained cold spots concentrated specifically in the basement. Contractors doing renovation work in the 1990s reported tools disappearing and reappearing in locked rooms. Today, the house operates as an event venue and offers public tours, including overnight paranormal investigations that book out months in advance. Whether or not the original fire story is accurate, the house has become something larger than its own documented history, a place where each generation adds its own unexplained detail to a story that was never fully verifiable to begin with. That pattern, a real tragedy, retold and reshaped over generations until the original facts blur, repeats itself across the state. Nowhere more so than in a patch of forest most Indiana residents have never officially visited, because officially, it barely exists. Stepp Cemetery sits inside Morgan-Monroe State Forest, reachable only by a narrow gravel road that the state doesn't maintain particularly well. It is a real cemetery, with real graves, dating back to the 1800s, a small burial ground for the Stepp family and their neighbors, people who lived and farmed in this stretch of forest before the land was absorbed into state property in the 1930s. The reputation that surrounds it today has almost nothing to do with the family it was named for. In the 1960s, local teenagers began telling a story about a woman known as Stiffy Green, sometimes described as a grieving mother who died on the grounds, sometimes as a hooded figure who watches over a particular grave. The story shifted with every retelling, gaining new details: a black dog, a stone that reportedly changes shape depending on who's looking at it. None of this appears in any documented record of the cemetery's actual history. What does appear in records is something else. The site's isolation made it a magnet for teenage gatherings for decades. An Indiana Department of Natural Resources incident reports from the 1970s through 1990s show a recurring pattern: vandalism, alcohol-related incidents, and at least one reported death connected to activity at the site, though not to any supernatural cause. The state eventually restricted vehicle access to slow the traffic. It didn't work particularly well. The cemetery's remoteness, the very thing meant to protect it, became the reason people kept finding their way back. What Stepp Cemetery demonstrates is something documentary researchers see across nearly every haunted rural site in America. Isolation itself creates its own gravity. A place doesn't need a verified ghost story to become frightening. It just needs to be dark, hard to reach, and just believable enough that nobody wants to be the one who's wrong. Not every location on this list is remote, though. Some are hiding in plain sight, inside towns most Indiana residents pass through without a second thought. A death, a closure, a failure of care outlives the people who remember the facts and gets handed down instead as something looser, stranger, harder to verify. That may be the truest thing about Indiana after dark. The state isn't haunted by ghosts so much as it's haunted by its own history, the parts it built monuments to, and the parts it just paved over and hoped no one would ask about again. Someone always does. That's it for today, guys. Thanks for watching. Also consider subscribing to our channel.